for the elite colleges, and country clubs comes about after Darwin writes that book, because responsible people say, well, it's up to us to separate out the good stuff from the bad stuff, and let the bad stuff, wallow in its badness. Every major philosopher in Western history, there aren't any exceptions, said that the vast majority of the human race was hopeless. Where they differed was the cause of the hopelessness and the amount of people who weren't hopeless. So John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, and there's a book worth reading if you have about a year off, because it's written by a lawyer. Calvin was a lawyer. It's about 1,400 pages in small print, but Calvin clearly invents the school system we have now, and he says that you've got to set people constantly competing with one another for worthless prizes so that the good people can get on with what really matters. Well, Calvin wasn't the first who said that. Plato said that in his two, the Republic and the Laws, those are his two utopias, taught in every worthwhile college on the planet, not just in the United States. People are hopelessly trapped in their intellectual and character class. And while you have to lie to them that there are ways out of that, the reality is that you have to see to it that they don't get in the way of the real people. So after Plato, Charlemagne and his educational mafia, Alcuin from England, said essentially the same thing, and now Calvin says it in the 15th century, and we move straight through the so-called liberal philosopher Spinoza in, it'd be the late 17th century, and we can trace it all the way down to right now, to the No Child Left Behind law. The idea is that you've got to keep these people busy, right? The devil finds work for idle hands, except Plato was going to do this philosophically, and Calvin was going to do it religiously, and Darwin said it had to be done scientifically, so that right in the upper regions of the atmosphere, where the policy classes breathe, there are a whole lot of different narratives circulating than the ones circulate down in PS10 or Junior High School 44. And we need to recognize that. Maybe this is a universal part of human nature. Certainly the founders of the Constitution, as they reveal themselves in the Federalist Papers, believed that. But they weren't hopeless about it. They thought you could put safeguards in place as long as you didn't grow lazy and fall back into the old way of thinking.
James Bryant Conant, I want to go back to him for a minute, said, education is what the school delivers.
Oh, he's furious. You've got to read the first 10 pages. The steam is coming out of his ears. He's not going to waste his time talking about this kind of education or that kind. Whatever the school delivers, that's education.
But this is really profound, because when asked what education is, that kind of an answer. So basically, education as we know it, formalized education, has been
schooling.
Schooling has been shaped.
And it's such a useful distinction to separate those two terms, and you ought to do it just out of common sense, because the only other place we use school is with crowds of fish, so that all the fins and the tails move at exactly the same speed. Schooling has some value. If you have to learn to take a rifle apart and put it back together blindfolded, and you have to do it in, 65 seconds or whatever, they run you back through basic training, it's quite a useful way to learn that mechanical trick. The more of those tricks you learn, the less your brain is able to function as a policy mind functions, in context, not in problem solving. That's the latest big lie, is the highest form of thinking is problem solving. No, it isn't. No, it isn't, because an awful lot of problems create greater problems when they're solved. You need a policy component in your mind that thinks in context. Think only of, I'll give you one example of that because it's colossal and it almost ended life on Earth. Sometime in the late 30s and during the Second World War, colleges were set the task by the government of coming up with something that killed all the bugs. You could double, triple, quadruple your harvest yields that way. And sure enough, they did come up with it. It was called DDT. And it killed all the bugs. It also killed all the small organisms right down to the beginning of the food chain. And so if it weren't for a woman who really put her job on the line, I think she worked for the Museum of Natural History in New York. Rachel Carson was her name. Silent Spring,
yes.
In which she showed in painstaking detail how the DDT was eliminating the chains of life that create the plankton, and the plankton are what the fish, and then the birds and all the rest of that fishy goss. There, she says, we are exterminating life on Earth. And it's funny. It really is funny, Kim, because most of the time someone screams out that way, it lasts for a few years and then it vanishes. But in this case, enough people in the policy classes said, she just may be right. There is no more DDT. It's illegal all over the world. I'm sorry, I'm just sort of choking on the enormity. The mechanism we've created closes us off from clear thinking. You'd think anyone listening to this show would realize they've never asked anyone for their standardized test score. It has to be because the information's worthless. They've never actually sat down and reasoned that through. They just know it. We all know it. So why are we sending 10% of the time down the toilet in schools of presuming they're worth doing? I'll tell you the great way to heal yourself, anyone listening, all of us, is to take the 10 or 20 leading private boarding schools in the United States, almost all of which came about because of Darwin's book, and see how they manage their students. Now, I know you've got skeptics listening who say, yes, if we could afford $50,000 or $60,000 a year for the kids at home. The funny thing is when you extract what those schools do, they don't cost anything. The grounds may cost a lot of money to keep up, and the salary scale may be outside the public school salary scale, but the burden of teaching is largely shifted from the faculty to the students. Exactly what has to happen in an open source system. And if people say, what is this, open source? That's what we had from the colonial beginnings of this country right through the Civil War. schooling was open source. If it existed, and it did exist all over the country, it was a matter of 6 to 8 weeks a year, 2 hours a day. They knew that once you